Inzektor decks used to have a sufficient level of success in the meta in the past, at least until their two best cards were limited. While these cards remain limited, the competitive potential of Inzektor decks still remains due to their ability to produce significant advantage over multiple turns. So, what's my Inzektor deck built like? Like most of the time when looking at a specific archetype, I focus first on the direct support. Starting off with Inzektor Giga-Mantis, this is definitely a solid card that significantly augments the attack of an on-field Inzektor when equipped from the hand. Most of the time you're going to find a way to equip this to Dragonfly, because Dragonfly, when you normal summon it, really doesn't have the attack points to give you confidence that it's going to stay on the field. The secondary effect is also nice, allowing for combination plays and easy swarming. Overall, there is very little bad about this card outside of the fact that it's a horrible top deck and should almost never be a monster on the field because its effect only involves it acting as an equipped card, not as a monster. Due to the reusability of this card from the graveyard and the negatives associated with its potential as a monster, I do only run one copy. Giga Weevil is just an inferior version of Mantis in my opinion because it augments defense instead of attack, and Inzektors want to have a more offensive flow to them than kind of a defensive helmety feel to them, so I feel there's very little reason to run this card. Honestly, it would probably be the worst Inzektor monster if not for Giga Cricket. Giga Cricket, this is the worst Inzektor monster in my opinion. When the major selling point of a card is piercing, the usefulness of that card is immediately put into question. I would stay away from this card. Inzektor Hopper is a nice solid choice for the deck, for with an attack power of 1700, it has the potential to do some damage, and it's not a significant liability on the field. Also, its equip effect is useful in multiple ways. The chief value of Hopper's effect as an equip is that it can send itself to the graveyard, which increases the efficiency of Dragonfly and Centipede's effect. The associated direct attack can also be useful when you need to get that extra 1600 damage to end the game, allow Centipede to attack directly. It's also worth noting that Hopper's innate send to the graveyard effect does have some limitations in that you cannot activate it during main phase 2 because the battle phase is already passed and can only be activated once per turn. For me, 3 copies work well. Some people probably think that only running 1 is sufficient, but I would disagree. You'll understand also more when you see this deck build, but remember, because Hornet and Dragonfly are limited, the number of serviceable Inzektor monsters is limited as well. Finally, running multiple copies can see benefit through the level augmenting effect for making rank 7 XZ plays when you're facing down monsters that can't be destroyed or you need to stall, or when Centipede has basically kind of outlived its usefulness because you've searched through most of your deck for your other Inzektor monsters. You can put one of these guys on one Centipede, you can put another Hopper on another Centipede, XZ, make your rank 7 play, and get some advantage. Inzektor Earwig, it also has some positives in the deck, mainly as a decent equip effect, increasing attack by 1000, which works nicely with Hopper, Centipede in getting over large monsters, and the effect remains after this card leaves the field, so if this card is used as a combo equip, you still retain a level of combat advantage for the given turn. However, due to existing deck space issues, I choose not to run any copies. Inzektor Centipede is a must at 3 in my opinion. Just read the effect and the reason becomes rather obvious, especially in an environment where Dragonfly is limited to 1. Inzektor Dragonfly is a must at 1 because that's all that's allowable. There's good reason for why Dragonfly is at 1, and really it probably should stay at 1 because it's kind of a cheap card, and it's the major trigger for swarming in this deck, especially in producing OTKs. One of the 2 principal goals of any Inzektor deck should be getting Dragonfly onto the field as soon as possible. Inzektor Hornet is also a must at 1 due to its ability to consistently produce advantage. In combination with Dragonfly, at least 2 cards on your opponent's field are going to be destroyed. In combination with Soul Charge, your opponent might as well just say, okay, everything on my field dies. The fact that this card can send itself to the graveyard via its own effect is really what gives it its power and its efficiency. Getting this card into your graveyard is the other top priority of any Inzektor deck. Hornet into the graveyard, Dragonfly onto the field. Those are your 2 #1 goals when you're running an Inzektor deck. Inzektor Ant would have been a nice card if Inzektors had some form of high attack power monster, say 2200 attack, that could consistently re-equip it. Unfortunately, this is not the case, which makes Ant a difficult card to find a place for in any real Inzektor build. Because they don't have this kind of helmety type monster, Inzektors are a swarming deck that tries to rip advantage using Centipede and Hornet. They can't really be a good helmet deck that tries to ride one monster to victory because they don't have that monster. Ant's a card that would be ideal for a helmet Inzektor build, but it definitely doesn't characterize the way I run Inzektors, and I'm not sure it's a good way of characterizing how anyone could probably run Inzektors. The swarm strategy seems to be much more efficient, much more available than the helmet strategy. Inzektor Ladybug is a card that a lot of other Inzektor players run that I do not. While the advantage of sending itself to the graveyard through its own effect to trigger both Dragonfly and Centipede's effect is attractive, I believe there are better options that help speed and enhance the swarming nature of Inzektors. Overall, I think the argument for running Ladybug is from a bygone era, of when players could run 3 Dragonflies. Without 3 Dragonflies, Ladybug, it's just not very useful anymore because it loses a lot of its catalytic potential. For example, what was a common play back in the day with 3 Dragonflies? Well, you had extra copies, and you had a higher probability of drawing it to hand, so a frequent play would be normal summon Dragonfly, you'd attach Ladybug, use Ladybug's effect to send it to the graveyard to activate Dragonfly's effect, special summon Centipede, attach Ladybug from the graveyard, then send it back to the graveyard via its effect to activate Centipede's effect, search for another Dragonfly, add it to your hand. Now with both the on-the-field Centipede and Dragonfly at level 5, you could go into any appropriate rank 5 play you wanted without fear because, hey, I still have a Dragonfly in my hand, I have a Ladybug in my grave, I can do the same thing, normal summon the Dragonfly, get out the Centipede, do my thing, search for Hornet, blast some people with Hornet. So it doesn't really matter what happens to this rank 5. My opponent makes some sort of play that gets rid of this XZ monster and my first Dragonfly goes to the graveyard. However, now in the world of 1 Dragonfly, players must be more careful about what plays they make with that Dragonfly. Do I have recursion in my hand? Can I get it back somehow? So you have to be careful. You can't be as liberal and carefree. Therefore, I find that in the era of the 1 Dragonfly, Hopper is just a better card. It has more attack, it has a better XZ target at level 4, its level augmentation when equipped produces a better XZ play in my mind, and it has a better lingering graveyard send effect. Some might argue that with only 1 Dragonfly, running Ladybug is still the choice over Hopper, because you can search out Dragonfly with Insect Imitation. While this is true, the problem is, outside of Ladybug to something, either Dragonfly or Centipede, whichever is important at the time, Insect Imitation, or Transmodify for that fact, is just a dead card, leading to significant inefficiency. Inefficiency does not interest me. Inzektor Firefly is just not very useful. I would avoid it at all costs. As I mentioned when talking about Ladybug, in both Inzektor XZ monsters, they're decent, but I think their ranks at 5 and 6, when you look at all the other monsters available in the Inzektor deck, they're a little too inconsistent. They're pretty much entirely dependent on Ladybug, and their effects just aren't useful enough for my taste. And also, when you see the end of this deck build, you'll realize that extra deck space for me is at a premium, and these monsters don't really work well with my philosophy or my build structure in this deck. Moving on to the spells and traps, final Inzektor costs too much to be valuable in this deck. When Dragonfly was at 3, activating this card was definitely probable. However, with Dragonfly at 1, the sheer lack of free monster summoning really hurts this card's playability. Also, Hornet pretty much does the work of this card at much lower risk and cost. Armor Blast is one of those unfortunate cards because it inhabits that in-between area of I'm not really that good to wow, I'd be really good. The current design puts it more at the not too useful side of the spectrum rather than this is a very good, possibly overpowered card. The fact that it's a normal spell is largely why, because you run into consistency issues both born from its activation requirement and the narrow destruction requirement. If this card were quick play, though, it probably would be too powerful. So it's kind of unfortunate that Armor Blast inhabits that annoying area of if we try to design it properly, it's just not good enough. If we don't design it properly, it just becomes too powerful. Overall, this card can be a nice side deck when you're dealing with pendulum decks or stun decks like Yugioh and all of their face-up trap cards, but right now in main deck, probably not really that useful. I'm not a huge fan of Inzektor Sword because while it can certainly produce advantage with its sent to the graveyard effect, the fact that you can't recover it from the graveyard in any innate capacity hurts its overall usefulness. Realistically, the 800 attack increase from this card is nowhere near sufficient in my mind to justify running this card over a simple revival card like Call of the Haunted, Oasis of Dragon Souls, or Powerful Rebirth. If Inzektor's ever got a card with a normal summon trigger effect, then this card might have a purpose, but until then I think it's just inferior to those other cards. When looking at Inzektor Crossbow, yeah, I don't like it. Just say no. The big problem with Inzektor Axe is that most of the battle traps in the game should not be a big issue for Inzektors because when they're going to make their swarm push, the opponent's back row will more than likely have been devastated by Hornet's effect or other more standard-based back row removal. I don't think this card offers anything significantly useful to the general playstyle of Inzektors because of that fact to warrant running it. For a brief moment, there is something appealing about Inzektor Gauntlet, where one could equip it to Dragonfly and then just blast the opponent with Hornet once per turn, continuously netting huge advantage. One realizes that Dragonfly is at 1, Inzektors are not a stun deck, and Castell exists. Well, so much for Gauntlet. Inzektor Orb just does not provide enough usefulness to warrant running it, in my opinion. Orb is another card that has that stun helmet feel to it, and even though Dragonfly is only at 1, there is just not an Inzektor monster that's so important that running this card is preferred to, again, something like Call the Haunted or Powerful Rebirth, to simply revive the targeted monster. If this card did something else other than just the mediocre attack defense increase and the target protection, then it would probably be worth running. Zect Conversion is probably the best spell to trap direct Inzektor support card acting as a different type of creature swap. However, the big problem with the card is that outside of the combination with Earwig, it just seems inferior to creature swap. Some might argue it combos well with Hornet, and it probably would, if an opponent would actually attack a face-up attack position Hornet with a multiple back row, or even just one back row staring him in the face. Variable Form really reads like one of those cards that was designed for the first generation Union monsters. While it does have its uses, those uses are too far and few between to warrant running it in this deck. If only it had some additional effect that maybe like compounding that gave the player effects based on the number of times his effect was used over a set period of time, then it would have more usefulness, but that's just not the case. Alright, that completes the review of the direct support cards for the Inzektor archetype. So, what about the rest of the deck? First things first, getting Hornet into the graveyard is one of the two highest priorities of the deck. So, while all of these cards are dark attributes, also all level 4s or less, it's outside of Giga-Mantis. So, when choosing between Armageddon Knight and Mathematician, I think Mathematician wins rather easily due to its 100 points of additional attack power, which, that 1500 range is kind of one of those important range differences. It's just not 100 points. Mathematician at 1500 can suicide into a number of other things that Armageddon Knight just can't get over. Also, of course, Mathematician's additional Destroy Me by Battle, you draw a card effect. So, 3 copies of Mathematician. However, 3 copies of Mathematician for 1 Hornet, it seems like it's a little overkill, despite the incredible importance of Hornet. So, to increase the efficiency of Mathematician's dumping effect, the addition of another monster is warranted. What other monster can provide utility to the deck as a whole, as well as work with Mathematician? For me, I like running 2 copies of Plague Spreader Zombie in this deck, for it works well with Mathematician and opens the door wide for a variety of synchro plays, including a very nice synchro play that's generally reserved only for insect monsters. While the ability to produce a continuous spell card every turn with an Inzektor on the field, an interesting tech card for this deck is Beatron. Beatron can send 1 face-up spell or trap card to the graveyard to special summon 1 insect monster from the graveyard in defense position. Basically, Beatron helps trigger Dragonfly Centipede's effect, as well as increases field presence. This field presence can be valuable in combination with something like Plague Spreader's innate special summoning effect for putting high-level synchro monsters on the field. Finally, closing out the monsters, I run 1 copy of Dark Armed Dragon because there's a number of dark monsters, and this build also has a nice ability to manipulate the number of dark monsters in the graveyard, making summoning Dark Armed Dragon a little easier. I run my 5 typical staples, 1 Regeki, 1 Book of Moon, 1 Soul Charge, and the 2 Dark Holes. Running the quasi-staple Foolish Burial is also useful for depositing either Hornet or Plague Spreader into the graveyard for more efficient plays, so let's add that in. Also, because getting to Inzektor monsters is important in this deck, and the field clearance ability of Hornet makes speed even more important, I do run 3 copies of Upstart Goblin, because that additional 1,000 to 3,000 life points for your opponent is kind of meaningless when you're nuking 2-3 cards additionally a turn because of Hornet's effect. With the presence of 3 Mathematicians, 2 Plague Spreaders, and 1 Hornet, I do run 2 copies of Creature Swap, because, as I said, I think it's a superior card to Inzect Conversion, especially because you can use it with the Mathematicians and the Plague Spreaders. Using Creature Swap in this way, you're going to get a better monster from your opponent, and you also receive the side benefit of the death of the monster you swapped. Mathematician, you're going to get the draw. Plague Spreader, it's going to be in the graveyard where it can use its effect. And Hornet, it's going to be in the graveyard where you can later use its effect. Finally, rounding out the spells, I run 2 copies of Mystical Space Typhoon to eliminate the annoyances that can stop the special summon swarming capacity of this deck, like your opponent flipping over that fiendish chain when you put Dragonfly on the field. Finally, for the traps, I run 4 of what I view are my typical staples: 1 Torrential, 1 Bottomless, 1 Solemn Warning, and 1 Compulse. Again, I run Compulse over Ring of Destruction because with the huge destruction capacity of this deck, Ring of Destruction becomes somewhat redundant. So Compulse is there to deal with targets that can't be destroyed. I also run 1 copy of Vanity's Emptiness, although using it effectively in this deck is a little tricky, because you have to forego sending monsters to the graveyard through Inzektor effects, so be careful on that. But it does shut down your opponent fairly well. With the presence of Beatron, as well as the ability to just be a pain in the butt for the opponent, I run 3 copies of Fiendish Chain. Another tech card I like for this deck is 2 copies of Pinpoint Guard, for it wards off all battle damage on the turn of activation outside of piercing effects, which are few and far between, and almost always it's going to ensure the survival of your monster on your field until your turn. Maybe I'm a little biased on this tech because I've had too many times when I flip over Call the Haunted, my opponent flips over a set MST. Well, there just went my attempt to get Dragonfly back on the field. And I really don't play the Inzektor XZs as previously mentioned, and also the defensive advantages, I like Pinpoint Guard over something like Powerful Rebirth. For my extra deck, we run a mixture of Synchro and XZ monsters. I run 1 Leo, Keeper of the Sacred Tree, pretty easy to get out on the field. 1 Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier, also easy to get out on the field, a 4/3 and Plague Spreader. I run 1 Beals of the Diabolic Dragons. I run 1 Stardust Dragon to try to protect my swarm from mass removal effects. One of the nice reasons here to run Plague Spreader is 2 copies of Underground Arachnid. Very nice synchro monster to run in an insect deck. I run 1 Armades. Moving on to the XZs, because I have access to a rank 7 pool because of the effect of Hopper, I run 1 Mecha Phantom Beast Dracosac. I'd run 1 Big Eye, but deck space. I run the 4 rank 4 staples, Exoton Knight, number 101, Castel, and XZ Dragon. I also run 1 Anti-Luminescent Knight, try to keep those MSTs off your back row, 1 Gaga Cowboy, and in case I don't really have anything available to me and I need to stall for time, and all I have are those centipedes, I run 1 Wind-Up Zemanes. Overall, while the loss of the 2 Dragonflies certainly hurts the competitive ability of Inzektors, it nowhere near killed the deck as a competitive option. As long as both Hornet and Dragonfly are not banned, this deck can produce significant advantage to roll with a number of decks, even Tier 1 decks. In my experience, this build works very nicely in a competitive environment due to the hybridization between the synchro plays fostered by Plague Spreader and the Inzektor plays. For example, Underground Arachnid is a very nice associated monster that is rather easy to get onto the field, that can hold the field while you wait for your Centipede or Dragonfly play. Well, that's my Inzektor deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.